So I've got like a couple of sample questions, but I was wondering first if anybody's got anything like burning in their heart about just, either conversations they've had with a seller in the last week or a month, or or just things that they're thinking about as they're thinking about upcoming listing appointments and knowing that they're going to get some questions about whether they like why they're supposed to pay, if they think they're not supposed to pay anybody or not, and kind of what have we encountered? Anything at all? Nothing at all? Okay. Well, then I'll dive into a couple of questions I had. I would love to see a bunch of you guys get on video and be ready to not be on mute, because this is not going to be me talking at you for an hour. It's going to be us talking together for an hour. So please be ready to jump in here as we dig into some of these. I guess like first and foremost, let's talk through like what are the pros and cons of offering money to pay a buyer's agent, whether it be through commission or concessions? Like, what are some pros and cons? What are some of the first things that you guys think of as you think, like if a seller says to you, like, why is that a good idea or why is that a bad idea? Like, what are some of the first things that come to your minds?
I think it's a good idea to offer that, to have that as an option and to offer it up front. Just because coming off of the way it's been done for a number of years, it's just going to be hard, I think, for realtors to understand what their options are. And until they get comfortable talking about to their buyers what those options are and have the buyers understand, it just may be a little bit more challenging right now.
Mm-hmm. For sure. For sure.
Initially, right out of the gate, this is all, pretty rough to understand. Again, like we said this morning, especially if your buyer is also your seller and you did your net sheets, with them where you included the option for them to pay for a buyer representation. And I just think too, I hear people say it flippantly, but it's really the case. Like, we don't work for free. And I think we're all assuming that the buyer agent agreements are all filled out correctly, in that those buyers agents are actually getting paid. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, we realize that the buyers agents call us and say, we're really operating under getting this paid through the transaction. We didn't, I haven't written anything in there if there isn't, buyer, if the seller isn't funding it or offering a concession. And we could always say, well, that's on you. But at the same time, we are transitioning. So we may have to get through something like that before we get to, what might be more acceptable.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would hope that everybody is following the rules set out by the NAR settlement, which makes it very clear that a buyer agreement requires a concrete dollar amount or percentage to be on that agreement. I would hope everybody's following that, but maybe they're not. I don't know. But I guess, can anybody think of like what's a scenario where there's, I mean, if you guys, some of you, I'm seeing some familiar names here from just an hour ago, and we talked through with Jeremy for a minute about kind of wrestling with like maybe it's not necessarily overly negative to not be offering something. Like what are some potential pros? I think it's, even if you don't agree with them, like what do you feel like some of them might be? Because I think we need to be like prepared for the full conversation, not just why we're going to say it's a good idea for there to be commission or concessions offered.
I think a pro is that buyers agents will be making more money in the long run. Sorry, I'm in the car, so I can't turn on cam, but yeah, just that, like, I mean, we see the commissions going down, I mean, especially like recently, we're still in a heavy seller's market in a lot of areas. And so, you will have to reduce commission sometimes to get the deal done, or some agents are offering 2%. So just the ability to be taking, you know, a minimum 3% every time.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a fair point on the buy side that, you know, we've made careers as buyer's agents out of never dictating commission unless you just do like a minimum commission and you're working with investors. It seems like, you know, agents selling houses in typical price ranges on the buy side will take whatever the MLS says they're going to get, basically, which has become more and more unfortunate. So that's certainly true. I can appreciate that, Grace. What about on the seller side though? Like what's a potential? It's like I mean, there's like the most obvious one, which is like the for sale by owner pro, which is, well, by paying less, I'll net more. But what, I mean, like, is there like more thoughtful scenarios where either not offering something or offering something that's fairly nebulous, like the seller's willing to pay money towards a buyer agent commission as opposed to pay X? Like, are there any pros?
Hey guys, sorry I was on a little bit late. I was finishing up another call. Andrew, I feel like one of the things that I've seen and I heard people saying is, you know, one of the pros is just the fact that it can be negotiated and that the seller might like obviously net a little bit more. But I also feel like a pro, are you saying what's a pro of not offering it, right? That's your question.
Yeah. Yeah, like what are the potential pros if they exist? But I mean, they're going to exist in a seller's mind, right? I mean, there's going to be sellers who are saying, I don't have to pay, and I think it's a good idea for me not to pay.
I think that what it could potentially open up is the opportunity for buyers to come directly to the listing agent. And if a seller is someone who believes that it's better to have one agent involved versus having a buyer's agent working quote unquote against them, I think that could be something in a seller's mind, you know, if they're savvy enough to think about that, where are they thinking, well, maybe it is better to just have you as the main agent and not have the buyer represented, because at that point in time, I'm represented. Obviously, we know the cons of that scenario, you know, but I think that from a seller's perspective, maybe they look at it like, well, why don't they just come and work with you directly? And then we can also save a little bit of money on the total commission and, you know, we're good.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective at all. So that's an interesting answer.
Well, then that brings in dual agency, doesn't it?
No,
Not in that scenario.
there can be one agent involved and representing one party.
Yeah, so the buyer would be unrepresented in the process, whereas the seller is the one represented because you don't have a relationship with that buyer prior to them coming to you for the property. So, I mean, and again, like this is not me saying that I think that this is actually in the seller's best interest. It's just I could see a seller who's savvy enough to think that way. Just like you have buyers that will call the listing agent now and say, I only want to work with a listing agent. And there's no convincing them otherwise that they can see the value of a buyer's agent, right? They think they're going to get a better deal. So I think you're going to have that maybe, you know, just depending on the seller. And I think that's an education piece for us to know, well, what is the value of having a buyer's agent, right? Like, how are we communicating that to our sellers? And do we see the value as a buyer's agent first and foremost, right?
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. Like, what can we tell a seller the value of working with a buyer that's working with an agent is? Like, what value is that to a seller? What do you guys think? How many of you guys have done a deal where
Well,
whether
for
you were acting as
instance,
a dual
if
agent or not?
if a buyer has an agent working with them, then the buyer's agent's making sure that they're pre-approved, making sure that the process is running on that side of the transaction smoothly. I mean, I personally, for sale by owners, it gets a little wonky when they don't know what they're doing, and you have to like school them all the way through that transaction. So yeah, I guess if you want to work out a little more money, but it's, you know,
I think you're onto something, Monica. I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that when you're thinking about it from a listing agent's perspective, right, or a seller's perspective, because the scenario you're talking about is when the seller's underrepresented, and what we're, either way, when the buyer's underrepresented in this process, what it comes down to is that buyer isn't having someone advise them, because we, as the listing agent, they're underrepresented, we cannot advise them on what to do. We can give them their options and say, this is what it is. What do you want to do? But ultimately what it can create is this, feeling for the buyers of, well, everyone's just out to get me, right? And it creates this dissonance between each other where they don't want to work with you on things that would normally just be a super easy conversation or something to work through and handle. All of a sudden gets blown up way out of proportion because there's not that other agent involved to help de-escalate the situation, and someone that they trust, right? Someone that's on their side, that is in their corner and is willing to go to bat for them in a sense, right?
Well,
So
that's my feeling on it. I just, sure, you can do that. I don't know. I just
Yeah.
think that it's a lot more, it's easier to manage expectations when you have someone that knows what they're doing on the other side. Of course, you can, manage them through that as well. As
One
far
of
as
the things
Right.
I've always thought too
approved and
about,
that sort
like,
of thing. I mean, those things you can, obviously walk them through because they have to do what they have to do. You can tell them that. That's not saying anything about the seller. I just
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree with both of you.
like
I
it's a
think
money
that
grab.
I think that it's I used to say this years ago that I wish there was like a mandate, a federal mandate that everyone had to be represented in a real estate transaction, not because I want more sides, not because I want more income, because I just think that it's a big enough deal that everybody deserves representation. And the essence of what we do is that's what we offer, right? Is representation. So I I don't think that it really is ever in anyone's best interest to not be represented. Certainly there are cases we've all done where it can go through. But I just said to someone the other day when we were talking about this, that, and this is what you guys were saying too, like if you're representing the buyer, the listing agent, that buyer agent, unless they're just, off the wall, and we've had those before, but they're few and far between, they can be an ally actually for the seller and for the transaction, because they're pulling the same comps that we pulled to do the pre-listing. They're going to explain to them and show them what's sold. The appraiser is going to come in and look at the same comps. So we're kind of all in the same, coming from the same approach. And that, commands the strongest price for the seller. It allows the buyer to offer a fair offer. When it's that one-sided and buyers think that they can do something, or a seller unrepresented thinks that they can do something, and we're put, sort of in the middle. I mean, I know dual agency can be done, and I've done it a lot of times myself, but it just never feels as right as it should be, because you can't focus on the best interest of both parties and do it
I
really that
completely
well.
agree. I completely agree with that. And, if I was getting divorced, I wouldn't have the same lawyer as the person I was.
And that's a great,
I would
that's a
not ask for
great
the same
comparison.
representative for that. I just feel like it is a big deal. It is a big transaction for both parties. And, let's face it, a buyer doesn't come into this knowing what the heck they're doing. Neither does a seller. I mean, how many times do they do that in their life?
Right.
yeah, I think one of the best sales pitches about buyer's agents is, like, a lot of the things we've talked about so far have to do with from like start of transaction, meaning like writing an offer, to closing. But the fact is, like, by the time a buyer is ready to buy a house, they're like a finished product that's been built by
Yeah.
that realtor, right?
Yes.
Because that realtor has like taken them from wherever it is they started, which is almost never where they end up, right? The
Right.
first time you meet with a buyer, they say they want to spend less than 300 in Lakewood or West Park, and then by the time it's all over, they spend 450 in Rocky River, right? And that takes an education process to get that person to where they need to be in order to make a decision that they can be confident in that they'll close on, right? Otherwise, you become the seller that sells your house in Lakewood to that person, and then after the inspection, they get all freaked out and they start second guessing themselves, and then they don't move forward, and then the deal dies. And then you go
Well,
back and
that's a very good point. That inspection is critical. And you're right. I mean, and if a buyer gets into a deal that far, and now they have to trust the seller's agent, who is not representing them, and they have questions that you may not feel comfortable answering, right? That can get really where the rubber meets the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that's where like this, the reason I feel like bringing up this conversation, bringing up this like kind of objection with the seller is really like when you're in that position, you're in that conversation, that situation with your sellers, you have to be prepared for knowing how you're going to answer that seller, right? Like, what are you going to be prepared to say to them? How are you going to present why it's valuable to have a buyer's agent if that's what you're trying to say is their best option, right? Like we have to be able, and it's funny because this kind of ties into like knowing your value as a buyer's agent, you know, it's the flip side. But I think that specifically for a seller, it's like we don't want to go into it saying, well, a buyer needs to have representation and it's best, you know, best for them, it's best for them. What we really need to do is figure out why is it best for the seller, right?
Too.
Like, right. And that's where like knowing what, like kind of working through this and processing this and having this in the back of your mind and theoretically like kind of going through these like, you know, case by case scenarios of how this conversation can happen, right? Like, what do you say when this happens? What should you say when this happens? And not saying that it's all going to be that scripted, but I think just being prepared for that and knowing what that objection could be if that comes up, you know, I think that it really just comes down to an awareness, right? Like having an awareness around, you know, how are we going to present this to a seller, right? Like having that prepared for yourself. Does anyone else have any other thoughts on, you know, I guess just like pros and cons of offering it versus not offering it? I mean, and again, like these are objections from a seller. Like, is there anything you could see your seller saying why they, you know, why they do, why they don't, whatever, you know, what do you see as the pros and cons?
I had a thought on what both the, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so my thought was, you're right, from the buyer's perspective, if you're a listing agent, having a represented buyer is really crucial, I feel like, because there's a big elephant in the room, and that's emotion. And when emotion is in the picture, it's really, really hard for people to make informed decisions. And when people are making these big purchases of a house, emotion is a huge factor. And so having a unbiased representation, as well as that clear thinking and also knowledge in the process from start to finish from an agent, I feel like it's really crucial on both ends as a listing agent. And then Andrew, like to answer my thoughts on your original question was, what are some of the pros of having that conversation or not doing the compensation? I feel like a pro is having that transparent conversation. Negotiations have always been a factor. However, I think that when a seller realizes that the ball is in their court, they may still come to the same conclusion that, you know, maybe I do want to offer that buyer's compensation. But when they at least have that choice, I think it makes them feel a little more trusted, a little more transparent in the process. And it kind of eliminates some of that fog, because I feel like in real estate, everyone thinks that someone's out to get them. Like the trust sometimes it's just not there. But having that dialogue creates that trust. And in the end, they may still realize that they may need to offer that it's beneficial to offer that compensation.
What do you guys think about this? You know, when you're talking to a seller, you know, throw all this other stuff aside. When you're talking to a seller from the day you got into real estate till now, you know, they're marketing their house. You are marketing their house. Part of that marketing is to bring buyers with agents that know what they're doing to the party. And there's a cost to that. I just don't see the big difference in that. I mean, you're marketing the house, you're marketing it to agents that are bringing buyers that are qualified, that are represented. There's a lot of value in that. And that's a part of a marketing thing. So I just don't see what the struggle is in explaining that to a seller. I mean, if they're hearing a lot of different mixed bag stuff out there, that's my concern. What's the mixed bag stuff going to be out there with agents throwing everything into the mix of how you can dance with this? I mean, I don't know.
Well, the strange understanding is it's not a like the understanding for a lot of people on the seller side is going to be that they're now allowed to not pay a buyer's agent. They were always allowed to not pay a buyer's agent, but now they're
Well, right.
somehow like that.
That's right.
That's become the terminology,
That's right.
and that's different than you like. You can, it was always negotiable, but that's not the statement that's being made. The statement that's being made is
Right.
you no longer have to do that. So everybody's natural reaction, if that's all the information they have, is, well, why would I do that then? Because they're not thinking about the rest of it, right? So that's the
Right.
that's the point of the
exactly right.
conversation for sure. But that's going to be that's the place that a lot of people are going to be coming from. Is
It's like, just think
I don't
about
have to do that anymore.
why is a listing agent doing that? Why was it structured that way in the first place? You know, and the other thing is, it's closing costs. This is really a little bit freaking me out. The closing cost part of it, it's like closing costs used to be a really major thing to get a buyer into the game. Well, the market will change at some point. And it's right now, closing costs, nobody even wants to hear about that because they don't even need to think about it. But the market will change, and there will come a time that that's going to be important. And then what do you do with your compensation and the closing costs? There's only 3% on a commercial deal. There's only 6% on you know what I mean? How are you going to try and close that?
Well, that's already been addressed. Lenders have already come out and said that, as long as you can show that this amount is going towards paying a buyer's agent's commission, they won't count that as concessions.
Okay, but the fact is, it's
Andrew,
Yeah.
I think that it's imperative as a listing agent that we are explaining to sellers that yes, they do have a choice, and yes, they always have. That hasn't changed, but it's in their best interest to still offer what's been done for decades. Talking about the fact that 40% of home buyers are first-time buyers and can't afford this, talking about the fact that their competition who's on the market, let's look at these comps, these people are all still offering 3% or 3.2. Do we want to eliminate a bunch of more buyers who can't pay this and they're just going to go to the other listings on the market instead of yours? And also explaining that it's a marketing piece to say that you're offering this compensation, and we're likely going to get offers that ask for it anyway. So why not take advantage up front of the marketing and bring more buyers in, potentially make more money anyway, because we're inducing a multiple because we are offering compensation.
Yeah. One thing I think is important, and the last thing you said, Jamie, is that moving forward, that we don't talk about this with sellers as though they can offer money to the other side, to the other side's realtor or not. Like ultimately, they're offering money to that buyer because that buyer, if they've committed to work with an agent, they've signed a buyer's agreement that says their agent's going to get paid X. So what that means for their listing is if they're not offering anything to pay that agent, that means the buyer's going to have to pay.
Okay, and the seller's going to say so.
And then you say, well, that just means that we won't be able to attract buyers that can't afford to pay their agent.
The other thing too, I think with that conversation is like things that have gone through my mind is the fact that like flipping the script and saying, like you said earlier on our sales meeting, putting them in the buyer's shoes themselves, but also, looking at like from an affordability standpoint, from a pricing standpoint, when we're looking at comps with our sellers, we have to be able to educate them and explain to them that this has always been built into the price. It has always been financed in, that the buyers have paid for this. So if we're now asking for the same high dollar amount for our home, and we're asking the buyer to pay for the commission on top of that, then we're kind of double charging those buyers, right? Like, unless you're willing to take the comps that we have and you're willing to say, okay, I'm going to reduce the price by 3% and then let the buyer pay that, that's not really fair to a buyer, right? Because at that point in time, they're gonna have to pay that top dollar amount price, plus they're gonna have to pay that 3%, on top of that to their buyer's agent. Why is that fair for a buyer to have to pay for this twice, right? And that comes down to numbers, that comes down to comps, that comes down to, how we're talking through pricing strategy for your house, right? Like that's just something. And again, there's no policing that. There's no way to know for sure, like, did that other listing offer a compensation or not? But right now, in the conversations right now, we know that the majority of the listings that have been selling are with a compensation, right? Like that the buyers are not paying that at this point in time. So at least for this conversation right in this moment, at this, snapshot in time, we can have that conversation with our sellers. And will prices come down? Maybe, but most likely not, right? Like we don't see pricing coming down. If anything, again, like we're still in multiple offers. So again, having that conversation and maybe humanizing it and explaining it to them in that way of saying, listen, it's the same thing. I have this conversation with with a first sale by owner, when they're not willing to pay a fee, right? Same thing. And I have a buyer. I'm like, listen, I get it. And at the end of the day, like, that's fine. If you guys want to sell this house for this price, that's what the comps say it's worth. That's what it will praise for. That's with knowing that all these other comparable homes that you're comparing to also paid a 3, a 2.5, or whatever the percent is. So if that's the case, then we'll offer, my buyers will pay that, but it's going to come through as a concession to that, or it's going to come off the price of the house, because it can't be both. You can't have your cake and eat it too, right? And so I think it's just the same conversation with your sellers and saying, like, you can't have both, right? So I think that's more of just like if you're talking to a numbers person, that might hit with them a little bit differently than talking about the value of having a buyer's agent, right? And explaining why.
Yeah, I think
So again, I think that you have
that side of the coin, it's just a pricing issue then, right? It's a matter of
correct.
like what for as long as we've all been alive, what's the thing that stops a house from selling?
Price.
Okay. So this is just like a different layer of pricing, right?
Correct.
But it becomes just a pricing issue, and that to the point I said to you a minute ago, Monica, I mean, that's all it boils down to. And if you overprice a house, you buyers stay on the sideline. So this is just another thing that'll keep buyers on the sideline. If, like Kelsey's saying, if it's like every house in the neighborhood is sold for between 4 and 420 for the last 8 months, and now you're going to list yours for 425, and you're going to state adamantly that you're not offering any kind of commission or concessions for the buyer to pay an agent with.
That's basically like you're overpricing your house by 3%. Yep.
Yeah.
You're overpricing your house 3% because you're all of a sudden 3% more expensive than those comparable homes.
I might be a little late to the game on this one. Okay, so what if, and this does happen, there's no appraisal gap and the house doesn't appraise for that concession to be covered?
I mean, we'd have the same problem that we've always had, which is that then, and think about every time a transaction is almost able to close, but not able to close. Both buyers and sellers turn towards their agents and wonder who's going to be the one that's going to put some money in the pot. So the same thing's going to happen, which is it's going to have to get worked out. It'll be different all the time. And some people will die. Sometimes people will put money in. Sometimes agents will put money in, and then it'll close.
And no matter what, everyone's in contract. Everyone has agreed to pay. So it's not like you have to say that you're reducing your fee, right? Like, it's already agreed. We have a compensation agreement in place. This is what your fee is as a buyer's agent. So they can't just say, okay, fine, well, then we're going to cut you out. Like, that's not going to happen, right? Like, that's not an option.
I'm just saying.
Yeah. And so, but I think that with that being said, though, I think that it's important to know that, like, it's no different than a buyer that, they're a 150 buyer. They needed that 6% in closing cost concession in order to be able to qualify for the house. They added that price on top of the house. It didn't appraise for it. All of a sudden, the seller can't come down that far and give the concession. The buyer can't, they can't afford to not have the concession, right? Like, it's going to become an affordability thing at that point in time, and who's willing to budge, and it's all negotiable at that point.
All right. Good thing we're in this market, not another one. Just saying.
Yeah. I feel bad for appraisers.
I think you were spot on, though, Kelsey, when you said it really is it's a matter of pricing. It's a matter of the discussions with the sellers. it doesn't start with the seller, it starts with us as either buyer representation or seller representation and our value proposition. It's all about that value proposition that we have and that we've scripted and that we know, so that they see the value in representation on obviously the selling side, but also on the buying side. So I just think that it's really important that we define that. It's why Keller Williams, spent 6 hours or whatever with the value to proposition. We should all go back to that PDF and look at that and make sure we embed that into what we're doing and what we're offering and what we say in our scripts until it becomes second nature on both the listing and the buying side. And then we can focus on the sellers and educating them, and the buyers and educating them, sellers on pricing, and educating the sellers on really what it means and what it feels like to be a buyer and what those challenges are and how they can command more in their sale price as a result of how they position their home, both list price, amenities, all that they offer, in addition to compensating another party to bring them, ready, willing, and able buyer. Because again, people aren't going to work for free. If you're putting an addition on your house, you're going to pay the roofer separate from the mason, separate from the foundation person, separate from the
general contractor.
electrician and plumber. I mean, they all have different skill sets. They all represent different goals that ultimately will give you that addition on your house. Similarly, the buyer agent represents and can provide a lot of good things to that seller to help them reach their goals. Should we take the time and have the scripts and understand how to explain that to them?
One of the things I think is really important in talking about the importance of buyer agency to a seller is not us just saying all the things that they expect a realtor to say to them. I think that's like one of the things we have to deal with in this process is the fact that like we can't just sound like good real estate soldiers that are going to go out and tell everybody why they should pay commission. Because that ultimately is going to just flop over dead with a whole lot of people. But those of us who have been doing this a while definitely have horror stories. And if you don't have any of your own, reach out to me or somebody and I'll give you some, because there's 1,000 good stories to tell. And when you say like, well, it's good because they're going to be more qualified, a seller's like, okay, I don't know what that means. I don't care. But if you really start explaining it in a way that's not just like, kind of like sales language, but rather like, let me tell you a story. Here's what happens. I think then they can start to connect with it, because then they think like, oh, you know what, you're right. Like I actually remember, Jim at work last year when he was selling his house, he went through that. That was a nightmare. But they don't ever think the nightmare is going to happen to them, right? The nightmare happens to somebody else. It doesn't happen to them. But I think it's going to be important to be armed with some decent stories about why buyer agency is good for a seller.
Very genuine.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, some of these things also come down to, I feel like, knowing the value, but also being able to communicate it. And I think when you're being more authentic and real and transparent, kind of like what Ashley was saying earlier, with your sellers, your clients, I also think that, making sure that they really do truly understand what we're here to do, which is to have a fiduciary, a legal obligation to represent their best interest, right? That at the end of the day, like I've always had this conversation because I've used buyer representation agreements for the past 8 years. So for me, this conversation has always come back to, I am here to be in your corner to look out for your best interest over anything else. So at the end of the day, like I'm always going to do what I feel is right and what I feel that is in your best interest. And if you're having that real authentic conversation with your sellers and you're saying, this doesn't come down to how I can make sure I make more money or how I can make sure that another realtor makes more money. This is coming down to knowing that you have options and what these options are and what the potential outcomes are, and that my whole job is to insulate you from as many potential issues in the process as I can, right? That I'm trying to protect you from the worst case scenarios that can happen. Not saying that it's going to be the perfect transaction, not saying that we're not going to have curveballs that come our way, but we know things from our experiences. And like Andrew was saying, stories that we have in our back pocket to share, you know, when we say that we're doing this because we truly believe this is in your best interest. And one of my favorite phrases that I'll use with clients is, we're on the same team. Like at the end of the day, no matter what, even these tough conversations, I know Kelly said this when she was talking about buyer representation agreements in the on the West Side last month. And she said, she was like, this is a tough conversation. Absolutely. But that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to have tough conversations for you and with you so that we are putting you in the best position possible. And also so that, you know, I'm also willing to have these tough conversations when I have to go to bat for you in negotiations, right? That when we're trying to get a repair done and the seller's not willing to budge, or the buyer's not willing to budge, or whatever it might be, that, you know, I am here and we are on the same team, even when things don't feel that way, because you feel like I'm just giving you bad news after bad news. I'm still here to be on your team, right? Like we're on the same team here. So we're all trying to get the same thing accomplished. And I think when you really set the stage for that in the beginning, and you're having that conversation prior to having the conversation around any compensation, like I think that that's helping them already let their guard down, right? Like they're already more comfortable. They feel like they trust you. And most of our clients, the majority of our clients are people that we are connected to in some way, shape, or form. There's not many of us that all of our business is coming from cold leads, right? Like for the most part, we're getting referred to these people somehow, or they're getting referred to us somehow. So lean into that. There's a reason that that person referred you. It's because they had a good experience, or they worked with me and they trust me and they want, you know, to refer a good person for you. So I think that the more we come back to like why we're here, what we do, how we do it, you know, I think that's going to help a lot of these conversations feel a lot more human and a lot more comfortable for people, because all of a sudden it's like, okay, you really are just trying to look out for my best interest. I got it. Okay. Like we're here, we're on the same team, you know, let's just make sure we get on the same page with this. We're both comfortable with it. Right. Does that make sense? Like, does that help anyone feel like, okay, this is a lot less complicated than some of us might, you know, think that it will be?
I think that sellers are going to be okay with paying. I think the problem is going to be how much that they want to pay.
That doesn't sound like Tom Newts.
It's Mike Mitchell portraying Tom Newts. I can already see conversations happening where they'll say, okay, we agree with you, but we've always felt that the commissions were too high. So now it's our chance to pay what we think we should be paying. And then they're going to want to know what they're getting for that 6% or 3%. And when everybody talks about marketing, that's fine. But I think they're going to start wanting to know, okay, well, you're throwing it in the MLS and that gets filtered down to here. And then you're going to run some ads and maybe some social media and, you know, whatever kind of marketing you do, flyers and whatnot. What's the price tag associated with that? I mean, we're going to have to be justifying what, you know, if we're selling a, you know, $600,000 home, what are we doing with that commission? That,
well, I think, Mike, I think the best answer is a very similar answer that you get all the time from contractors about the cost of something. You know, you can find somebody who does it cheap. You can find somebody who does it fast. You can find somebody who does it right. You can't get all three of those ever. And sometimes you can't even get two of them. Right. But the other thing is that like you get what you get from somebody based on their knowledge base. And like that's what people are paying for.
yeah.
Right. So you figure that when you encounter a problem in your old house on Edgewater, you can call the cheapest plumber you can find, and he probably is, you know, 25 years old and has no experience in old houses. He's been doing new construction plumbing since he started, and now he's going to come to your house on Edgewater and try to figure it out.
Right. No.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. So,
or you hire somebody that you feel like is going to be helpful to your cause. Right. And that's not always experience based. It could be, but that doesn't have to be your sales pitch by any means. But like so they're not, because yeah, to say like, what am I paying for? Am I just paying? I'm paying for you to, show me a dozen houses and write 2 offers and come to an inspection. Or I'm paying you all this money to put a sign in the yard and put it in the MLS. But like what they're paying for is all of the expertise that comes along with that, or all of the detail that comes along with that, or all of the care that comes along with that, whatever it is that you're selling as your value, right? That's what they're paying for. And that's where, I mean, sounds like you need to be at the value proposition workshop in a couple of weeks, because that's what you need to build.
All right.
Because that's the answer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
And I think, Mike, that's a good comment or good question and, thought too. I just feel like it's one of those things where, Andrew, the comeback on that one, I loved the fact that you kind of related it to the contracting business, because it is the same thing. And I think, even looking at, relating it to other professions, you hire an attorney, you hire a doctor, do you really want to have that first year resident doing brain surgery on you? Or do you want to have someone who's been doing this and has the knowledge base? And it's not for like the best perfect case scenario. Yeah, you might have the best, easiest, most straightforward surgery possible. But what if something goes wrong? What if you have a curveball that comes your way? Do you want someone, like you said with the plumber, like, do you want someone who's never operated, a steam heat before or galvanized pipe? Or do you want someone who, that's what they have done and they've worked in that area for, however long, and they know exactly what to do when those things happen, right? So at the end of the day, it's you're not just paying for my value to have, those best possible case scenarios. And obviously our goal is to insulate you and protect you and make it the smoothest transaction possible for you. And yes, you're also paying for my expertise to make that happen, right? To know how to make that happen, to be proactive, to be, upfront with our marketing and how we're going to price it and how we're going to market your home. And do we do staging? Do we not? How do we have our photographer come in? All those things, like all those things are what's going to make them have the hopefully smoothest deal possible. But naturally something could come up. An inspection happens, something comes up. Do you work together to get that done, or is the deal just dead, right? Like that's where your value comes in, because at the end of the day, if someone is not prepared for that conversation and they're not able to keep a deal together, well, that's great that they said they were only going to charge 1% and you're going to save $5,000-$10,000, but you also just lost your first buyer and potentially lose $10,000 because your next buyer that comes in, now we have to disclose this issue with the inspection, and it's been on the market for 21 days. And all of a sudden we might lose $10,000-$15,000 on the offer on your house. Right. So I think that that's where like kind of thinking through like what that looks like and what the value is and what we're really here to do, which is to, look out for their best interest. It's not just when things go perfectly, it's when things go wrong. Right. Like I just had a scenario like that a couple months ago with a seller that I ended up releasing them from the listing altogether because they just weren't disclosing and they were not being truthful in things. And we were under contract up until 3 days before closing. The buyers ended up walking away because of all these things that kept piling up from not disclosing and having to share with the buyers. And they walked away and it was a $470,000 house. And I had them under contract with like as is, buyer's knowledge only for inspections, like best case scenario, $15,000 appraisal gap, all these things. Everything was done. And sure enough, all these things happened. And then they ended up, we pulled it off the market. I released the listing. I just saw that it closed last week. I looked at it and it sold for $30,000 less than what it was originally under contract for. $30,000. Right. So again, it's like when you look at those things, it's like, obviously I don't wish that for the seller, but those are the actual real life, stats and experiences that can happen, when you're not proactive in doing things the right way with an experienced agent who's, encouraging those things. And I was encouraging them to disclose obviously ahead of time. I just didn't know. But just so you guys are thinking about those things too. Like, again, there's story after story after story. If you need stories of, things that can go wrong. Right. But my favorite are the first sale by owners that don't see the value in having an agent, and you bring them a buyer and you work with them and you do twice as much work for half of the, what it should be, what you're getting paid, but you do it anyways, because that's what you're here to do for your buyers. And then by the end of the transaction, that first sale by owner wants to work with you to help them buy a house. And they, are actually like appreciative and they see the value and they understand the value. It's like, sometimes people just need to experience it to know it and see it. Right.
Yeah.
But that's okay. Like you're there to try to turn them around. Does that help?
That helps. Plus, Andrew, I think you can add your good looks to your value add for your.
I suppose.
That cheery smile and laugh. Awesome. Well, it's 12:17, so we got about 10 minutes left for this. Is there anything else? This is for you guys. So like, yeah, we came with a couple of objections that we thought would be good for you guys to think about and talk through, but is there anything that you guys are thinking after these conversations that you're still nervous of? You're not really sure how to answer it? Thoughts?
I just had one other thought. I feel like fear and doubt is like easily transferred. And so when we are like talking to our clients in a way that has like fear or doubt, for an example, like if we're a listing agent and we're doubting like what a buyer's agent is doing, that fear is going to be transferred. And that's going to create all this doubt into the client's mind. And that's when all of those objections are going to come up where I don't want to pay this, or I don't want to do that. I don't want to, what about this? But I feel like if we can confidently explain to them the benefits of having that buyer's compensation, I feel like it can easily be, or it can be transferred better. And I feel like the only way that we can do that confidently is if we understand like both ends of the table. And so I think as agents, it's really important to understand both ends of the process so that when we are communicating, it comes across not as a script, something that we read, but something that we actually believe and know to be true.
1,000%. Yeah, I love that. And that kind of coincides for anyone that was on our sales meeting call today, the Zoom call we did, very similar to that conversation, you know, of how confident are you? How calm are you? You know, how are you handling these conversations in a professional way where your clients don't even doubt you, right? Like they're not even going to question if you tell them that this is what you feel is the best option for them, and you explain all the reasons why, and you explain all the reasons why the other option is not necessarily a great option for them. They already trust you. Like 9 times out of 10, they will refer to you. They want to work with you. They trust you. That's why they're working with you to begin with, you know, and even in, you know, competitive listing scenarios where you're competing for the listing, the more confident and the more willing you are to say this is what you believe and this is what your conviction is and this is the reason why, you're going to stand out from the other agents that aren't necessarily willing to be that confident in that conversation, right? Like you're willing to be, you know, you can address a hard conversation. You can address those questions in an intelligent, educated way, you know? So I think that's what it comes down to. I love that you said that, Ashley, because I completely agree with you. And I think that that's really the biggest thing that we all have to remember in this. Andrew, do you have anything to add to that? Any thoughts?
No, not other than, I mean, I think this is kind of along the same lines of what Ashley just said. I think it's important that we say things to people that are not just what they expect, which is sort of along the lines of what I said before about like, you know, if we just go out there and be like a good soldier that's gonna like fight for commissions, then we're gonna get treated like that's what we are.
Yep.
Right. And so it's really important that, you know, like what was just said, that we need to actually believe the things we're saying, and those things need to be at the core of what we're doing with people. If we're not going to go out there and tell people that in some situations maybe it's a good idea to not offer commission, if we're not going to do that, then we need to be real believers in why we're not going to do that. And I'm not saying don't do that necessarily. I'm still of the opinion that I think there's going to be times where that might not be an unreasonable option.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's good to talk about that with sellers, because that again is like, they're not expecting to hear that from you.
Right.
All they're expecting to hear from us is all about how they should pay as much commission as we can get them to pay.
Yeah.
That's their perspective of the process, so to speak, right? So I think, you know, the more times we say things that kind of fly in the face of who we're supposed to be when those things are bad things in their eyes, the further down the road we get of being trustworthy and being able to actually have a real conversation with them, that they'll actually be open and honest with us.
Right.
Andrew, can you give us an example or two of a time that you feel would be a good time to maybe suggest that they don't offer that compensation?
Yeah. I mean, I think in a scenario where I'm going to say Lakewood right now, just because that's the most recent market I can think of that I'm really familiar with, where you could list just about anything at almost any price and get 25 showings in the first weekend and probably get 7 or 8 offers, even if it was overpriced. They just might be at list price instead of above it, right? In that scenario, going right out and saying like, we're willing to give you X, maybe it's not a good idea. Like in that scenario, you're going to get offers where maybe people are going to ask for some, they're going to ask for things, and that's fine. But that might be the perfect scenario where a seller actually could sell their house for the same price and not pay anything or pay very little. But I think that it takes like the perfect mix of like an absolute seller's market that is like, beyond silly, where there's, 40 buyers looking and there's 3 houses every weekend coming on the market.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example, Andrew. I think it's like, you look at like Parma, you look at other locations like that.
And in those scenarios, that seller may still end up paying. But what I'm saying, to be clear there, Jamie, is I'm saying it may be a good idea to not throw a number out there and instead see what you get.
Right.
And if you list a house for 250 and the highest offer you get is for 275, and that offer is asking for 2% in commission, and you get other offers that are 265, like, okay, great. The 275 is a great offer. But if as soon as you put the number out there, you're probably going to get that on every offer that rolls in.
Well, and I think that that's where it's like you're putting the ball in the buyer's court in that situation, and I mean, we've all seen creative multiple offer things that people are trying to pull out of their, sleeve to try to get that buyer the house. And this is just now another lever that they can use in negotiations and multiple offers. Right. And I think it's one of those things, it's like, it used to go back to, like Andrew talked about this earlier, a buyer was willing to pay the sellers a certain amount of money towards the seller's closing costs. I mean, I know we used that in the past where it's like, listen, that's great that you can offer a $15,000 appraisal gap, but that means nothing to the seller if the appraisal actually comes in at value. So how can we guarantee that we're actually going to be $3,000 or $5,000 above another offer and offer the appraisal gap if we need it? But how do we guarantee that that seller is walking away with more money? That's a great way to do it. Now, this is the same thing. So we're saying, okay, we know that right there that we're going to be potentially, 3%, $5,000, whatever it is, higher than another offer if another offer is going to ask for that concession. And that's going to be an option for anyone, even when the seller does offer it, that the buyer is always at that point in time able to say, yeah, we'll pay this, right? And we can even say it's towards seller's closing costs, and the seller's paying our fee, or it's going to be straight to our fee, right? Like at the end of the day, it's all just, again, moving money around on paper, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think that it's good to think about, I think for us to really think about what is the best option for our sellers and understand the markets that we're in. Like at the end of the day, if we treat every single listing conversation, every single seller buyer conversation the same, and we don't think about it ourselves, then I think that's where we're going to find ourselves in the like commission breath conversation, right? That we're just trying to get as much money as we can, that we're trying to get as much money for the buyer's agents as we can, right? That we're not really thinking about our seller's best interest. So very, very seldom is that going to be a scenario where it makes sense, but there might be a scenario that makes sense, Does that help, Jamie? I think she's still
Yeah,
there.
it helps. It just makes
Okay.
me wonder the snowball effect of that. It's going to be the agents who just take that and just tell that to every seller and think that that's in their best interest. And then
Yeah.
we're creating a market where this completely flips in time.
Yeah, I think that just comes back down to the pricing, that if you overprice it and you're not in the right market for that situation, then that house is gonna be the one that sits in the market. So I wouldn't stress, because I think that the market will correct itself. I think that if you overprice it and you don't include that compensation, it's not gonna sell. Like at the end of the day, like you might find one buyer. So
It's also important to note that's the whole reason for this process, is to make it so that it's a market-based commission process, as opposed to just like it's already been decided and that's what it's going to be, right? That's the whole reason for all of these changes, is because that was deemed to be inappropriate. So whether you like it or not, that's the truth that we have. So we have to, and I think so entering this next phase with the mindset of like, the best thing I can do is make sure I get sellers paying commission. Like, I think you just have to question yourself a little bit on how true that is.
Mhm.
You have to question
Versus
yourself
like
on what?
you, like that being your reaction to this because you don't like it. That's all. And I hope that doesn't upset anybody. I'm not trying to, be mean about this, but I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah, just not being
Agents are
reactionary.
reacting this way because they don't want it to change.
Yeah. Yeah, don't be reactionary. I think be methodical, respond to your people in the best way that you can. I think that we have to take our own feelings out of this, and our own kind of really we have to be neutral. We have to take ourselves out of it as a buyer's agent. And if we walk into a situation that the seller is not paying the fee, and I think that's where, even from a dramatic standpoint, like it's gonna happen. Be prepared for it to happen. And just know how to have those conversations with your buyers and know how to have those conversations with your sellers. And at the end of the day, I think the more prepared you are, you're going to be fine, right? But I think that that's where like, you don't know what that conversation was with the buyer. You don't know what the conversation was with the seller. And if we go into it, truly looking out for our client's best interest first and foremost, I think that that's going to determine what the best answer is for them. But I think if we go into it reacting and being overly dramatic about the response and how we, react to them, I think that they'll see that too. Right. So yeah, I don't think that you're upsetting anyone, Andrew, by saying that. I think that that's a great point. I think that we have to think for ourselves and think for our clients, and really look at every case and see what makes most sense. So, so I know we have 1 minute left, so I'm going to go ahead and cap this off so we don't get going down another rabbit hole or anything like that. But hopefully this was helpful for you guys. Hopefully you guys, feel more confident and comfortable and we're able to just kind of hear some of these, objections and how they're handled and everything. So again, if you guys want to jump on to the next thing for today, it's going to be our Realtor Collab talking about seller conversations or seller presentations. And again, digging into this more and more with how we're actually presenting this to our sellers. So if you've not been on the Realtor Collab, sign up for that, get on that. I think you guys will enjoy it. Otherwise, there's a lot more trainings coming your way. So just keep an eye on the calendar and the schedule for everything going on. Otherwise, hope you guys have a great rest of your week. See ya. Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.